Woodworking on social media has gotten really complicated lately. It feels like it's practically unattainable. You need thousands of dollars in tools and massively large shops just to be able to do whatever the person on this side of the screen is showing you that they're doing. But how hard is woodworking really? That's the essential question for this video. I'm going to be sharing with you my experience with a handful of projects that I have routinely done over the last 5 years to cut through all of the bullshit and let you know that you can probably do most of what I'm about to discuss. So, this is going to be a contentious video. There's going to be a lot to argue with, and that is perfectly fine. My name is Jared, and this is Vulgar Woodworks. Before we get into any of the projects, we got to discuss this guy, the woodworking difficulty matrix. So, the way that this matrix works is the further on the left-hand side of the matrix, the easier the projects are, whereas the further on the right, the more difficult they become. The lower on the matrix, the less expensive. I don't want to say cheap, but that's what it says on the chart. But the less expensive a project can be, and the higher up on the chart, the more expensive. So now that we got that out of the way, let's jump into the first woodworking project that we all do, the gateway project, cutting boards. At its most fundamental, a cutting board is nothing more than just a wide, relatively long, flat piece of material. Something like this. And hell, this one needs a little TLC. But it doesn't even need to be as complicated as this. This is just a whole bunch of slats that were glued up together. If you can find a board that's wide enough, and then you can cut it down to a length that's suitable for your project, and you can get it flat, you've made a cutting board. I mean, in reality, a cutting board could take no more than maybe 20 or 30 minutes from start to finish. But social media woodworkers would have you believe that unless you're using 12 different species and you're making 45 different cuts and you're doing 12 different glue ups, that your cutting board is somehow not worthy. And that's just a bunch of bullshit to get views. That's all that is. Cutting board don't get no easier on this chart. And that's why it goes somewhere there. Next on the list, boxes. Okay, this is a fundamental woodworking project that we are going to do time and time and time again. Whether it's building small little boxes like this that hold tea bags and tea-related accessories, or it's larger boxes like cabinets, box building is incredibly easy. It basically boils down to four things. Can you find material that's flat? Can you make that material square? Can you join that material together? And once it's joined together, is it going to fall apart under its own weight? And other than that, again, everything becomes subjective. The type of joinery we're going to use, the type of material that we're going to use, the style of the box, and so on and so on and so on. Whether you're using miters, or you're using dovetails, or finger joints, or some sort of proprietary fastener that makes cabinet building a lot easier, box building is those four things. Flat, square, connected, and stays together. And depending upon the size of your box, the expense for a box is totally subjective as well. The smaller the box, you could probably get away with using just scrap wood. And bam, that's like free. But when it comes to cabinets, if you're building a cabinet that's freestanding and is going to be shown, then yeah, you got to use some nicer material. But if you're doing like shop cabinets or hell, even kitchen cabinets that are going to get stuffed up against walls, there really is no need to use fancy material. I've built kitchen cabinets out of MDF. I've built kitchen cabinets out of melamine, and nobody's the wiser because nobody can see the outside of the box. And I'm getting off on a tangent here. Box building is easy, and box building is as expensive as you want it to be. So I'm going to put it somewhere. Where am I putting it? I'm going to put it right there on the chart. Next on the list is truly a challenging project. I think if you were to ask 100 woodworkers what the most difficult project is that we undertake, 112 of them are going to say chairs. Chairs suck. I hate chairs. I don't like building them. Now, the reason why chair building is so difficult is oftentimes, unless you're building from a plan, if you're building from scratch, you have to prototype, because if you just build a chair, oftentimes we don't get it right the first time. So prototyping takes quite a long time, and if you don't get it right the first time, you got to do it again, and do it again, and do it again until you get it right. And once you do get it right, chairs often have a lot of parts and pieces. So that's a lot of processes that we have to go through. And where chair building becomes really difficult is that all of those parts and pieces have to get prepped and then assembled. With once you put glue down, you're on the clock, and that can become tremendously stressful. And then if you're lucky enough to get it all together, it quite literally has to hold our asses. So chairs are tremendously difficult, but the saving grace about chairs is that they're oftentimes not all that expensive. It's not really a lot of material to make a chair. So unless you're getting into upholstery where you're going to have to deal with fabrics and foam and all that wonderful stuff and the specialty tools involved there, if you're just simply making a wood chair, you might be invested even with fancy dancy material, 70, 80, 100 bucks. That's not all that expensive. But the problem becomes nobody ever asks for just one chair. You're always going to end up having to build 3, 4, 5, 12 of them if it's a dining set. Chair building's a pain in the ass. I think we can all agree on that. So that's why I'm putting chairs further over on the harder side of the matrix, but still pretty low as far as expense is concerned. Next on the list, epoxy projects. I think, again, if I asked 100 woodworkers what the most difficult or what the most annoying type of project is, they would all say epoxy projects. But here's the thing. Here's the dirty little secret. Epoxy projects, they're not all that hard. Okay, epoxy projects are pretty easy. It doesn't matter if you're using a deep pour epoxy like this, or you're using a bar top epoxy, or whatever else. The hardest thing about epoxy work is making sure that you get the mix ratio correct and the environment that you pour in is suitable so that you don't cook the epoxy, so that it doesn't result in bubbles. And the way that that becomes easier and easier is by pouring more and more epoxy, unfortunately. Now, epoxy is expensive. That is undeniable. And oftentimes the projects that we're putting them in, whether they're small little trinkety things or they are massively large epoxy tables, they will always balloon the cost of the project. That you just can't avoid. There are techniques out there to reduce the amount of epoxy, but that's neither here for this video. So when it comes to epoxy projects, I am going to still leave them on the easier side of the matrix, but they definitely become more expensive. I would say this. If you've never used epoxy before, start small and work your way up. Don't dive into a massively large epoxy dining table without learning your products first and learning the process. Start small, and then they become easier. Oh, the next project's always a fun one. Signs. Signs, for me, are a pain in the ass. Here's why signs are difficult. The construction of a sign. It's just a board with words on it, right? Not that complicated. But the reason why signs are so difficult is because we debate on which font is right. God, signs are a pain in the ass. Like, how hard is it to just choose a font that says live, laugh, love? Pain in the ass. In the end, guys, sign building truly isn't that difficult. It's usually just a relatively square, flat, rectangular piece of material with words on it. And then we struggle over what, color of grayish we're going to make the thing, or what font we're going to use. And what makes sign making difficult is if you don't have the tools to do it efficiently. This is where a thing like a CNC comes into play. You can kind of push people into certain types of fonts, design the thing, hit go, and then Bob's your uncle, it's done. If you're hand carving signs, that takes a little more time, but for people who are versed in hand carving, they don't think it's all that difficult. I can't carve for shit, so I just use a CNC, and sign making is pretty simple. It's pretty easy. Doesn't take a lot of time, but I am going to say that they're slightly more difficult than, let's say, boxes or a cutting board, only because we argue over what damn font we're going to use. The next project on the list are tables. Dining tables, coffee tables. I'm going to throw desks in there. And tables are tricky because we live in a world where we have so much inspiration. It becomes kind of hard to figure out what the style of the table is going to be, unless somebody puts like a Pinterest post in your face. I want that. Table design is tricky. We have to get proportion right. We've got to get style correct. It's not as easy as just slapping boards together to make a panel, and then all of a sudden you got a flat surface. There's a lot more to it than I think we are led to believe. And again, with experience, it becomes a little bit easier. But here's the thing that I have always found difficult with tables is everybody always wants a table that's way too fucking big. And I'm just one guy. The largest dining table I've ever built, I believe, was about 12 feet long and almost 4 feet wide. And that's really hard to manipulate in a small shop environment. You got to have the space to be able to accommodate that. Flipping it over is a pain in the ass, let alone moving it around. Like, just the sheer proportions of dining tables and coffee tables and desks just makes them really, really difficult. And understanding like your order of operations. Are you going to build a base first and then a top to fit the base, or are you going to do a tabletop first and then figure out the base later? A table build is a lot of fun. I enjoy the challenge, but I also just like realized, nah, I'm not as young as I used to be, and tables have become more and more challenging for me. I'm going to be releasing a video later on of my own dining table build so you can see all the fun that I had with that damn thing. So when it comes to putting them onto the matrix, I'm going to put them on the harder side of things. And as far as cost, the sky's the limit. If you're going to build your dining table out of Cocobolo, then yeah, it's going to be through the roof. But I've built a lot of dining tables, I hate to admit it, out of dimensional lumber for that like rustic, chic farmhouse look, whatever the hell that is. And they're pennies on the dollar comparative to building like yourself a solid walnut dining table. So argue with me all you want. I'm putting dining tables or tables in general, large flat surfaces there. All right, it's that time. I know I'm going to get a load of shit for this. The next project on the list are decks and porches. You guys ready? Here it comes. Decks and porches are not complicated to build. What makes decks and porches difficult to build for woodworkers is we don't know codes, we don't know structural engineering ins and outs, and we fixate on trying to make them into a fine woodworking project when in reality, they just need to be a place that we walk on. So we fixate on fit and finish, knowing full well that Mother Nature is going to kick its ass. And we use boutique finishes and we do all of these things like it's a really nice piece of furniture, when in reality, we just need to build the thing. Deck and porch building, I think, is relatively simple. It's building a substructure that is sturdy enough to be able to not only support the weight of the thing, but whatever forces are going to be enacted on us walking across it and moving things and so on and so forth. Now, personally, I have never built a deck or a porch that has been permanently attached to a house with something like a ledger board. I've always, pardon the pun, kind of skirted that portion of a build by always doing them essentially floating. But, the construction of like a box beam and all of the bracing and joists and what's all the stuff that you put in between the things? God dang it, I can't even think. But framing it all out in order to make sure that I've got spaces where when I lay my deck boards down, I can fasten them down correctly and make sure all of my screws are in the same line and so on and so forth. It's just grunt work. That's all it is. I'm sure deck builders, you're going to absolutely bash me in the comments, and that's fine. But for most of us who are just DIYers, it really isn't that complicated. Just understand that you're working with much larger spaces, so trying to be as close as possible to your measurements is good enough. You don't have to be so fixated on being off a 16th of an inch. Nobody's going to know. And just make sure that when you are done, your construction is nice and sound. So test as you go. If it's shimmying, you got to figure out how to make it not. If you're going with a traditional deck or porch where you're sinking posts, and that might be intimidating to you, then don't do it. Hire somebody else to do it and then frame it out after the fact. As far as where they go on our matrix here, I've got them, where do I got them? Decks and porches. I've got them still on the easy side because, framing's not that complicated, but they are always expensive because, again, nobody ever builds like a 3 foot by 4 foot porch. It's always 25 feet long, 10 feet deep. Yeah, construction materials, even for something like that, they get pricey. So I'm going to put them more towards the higher side, but still on the easier side of the matrix. Sticking with the construction side of things, because if I'm going to open myself up to it, I might as well just get it all out of my system. Framing. Okay, at some point in time, you're going to frame a wall, or you're going to build a shed, or whatever else that is going to involve framing. Framing walls, not complicated. Where it becomes difficult for woodworkers is, again, we are uber fixated on making sure that everything is perfectly fitting, flat, plumb, square, all that kind of stuff. And the reality is, as long as it's close, it's probably going to be good enough because nobody ever notices how wavy a wall is until you actually look down it. But when it comes to framing, what really gets tricky is doing things that are related to roofs. Okay, understanding hip valves and pitch angles and all these different things. Like you might need to bone up on, how to use a speed square. But As far as just building walls, really what's difficult is making sure that over the span of that wall, it doesn't toe out or in and stays relatively square as possible once you start to build the other three walls around it, so that when you're doing all the fit and finish, everything goes together smoothly. Now, I've built a lot of walls in my lifetime. I'm in the process of finishing off my basement incrementally, and I would say this: the key to framing something well is taking your time. You are not a professional framer, you're not a home builder. So speed is not crucial. If you are obsessed with flatness and you don't want 2x4s that got curves in them, then yeah, you may end up milling material, which is going to take time, or you're going to be rummaging through stacks of lumber to find the straightest boards possible. But as far as building a wall, it's not that expensive. Building a shed, not that expensive. So where am I putting these? Where framing? I'm putting framing square in the middle of the cheap and easy quadrant of our matrix, because again, it's all dependent upon how many walls you're building out or how large of a shed you're building. And construction materials are relatively inexpensive. And as long as you got a nail gun, framing goes really fast. Pretty easy. The next project on the list are countertops. I think countertops are a fantastic project for we woodworkers to take on, because oftentimes we can do it for less than somebody going out and purchasing a massive slab of granite or marble or quartz or whatever, and then having that custom fit. And I think the look of wood countertops rivals any stone out there. Personal bias, but I think it's true. When it comes to installing wood countertops, if you're going to go over existing countertops, then the absolute best material to use for that are floorboards, because they're already milled, they got tongue and groove joinery, and it just becomes pretty simple to lay out your first row, use some construction adhesive so that it's not moving around on you, and then just boom, build out the row or build out the countertop, and it goes pretty fast. Basic tools are required. You might need to rip something on a table saw. You're definitely going to need a miter saw to trim things down, but it is really easy, and it is a dramatic transformation that, depending upon how much countertop space you've got, you could probably knock out in a weekend. I think countertops are a really, really good project for you to tackle, even if you're at that beginner level, because I'm putting them on the easy side of things. But because you're using floorboards and because you really want that wow factor, you're probably not going to use the cheap shit. So yeah, countertops made out of wood, they can get a little bit pricier. So I'm putting them right there on the matrix. Sticking with flooring is actually flooring. Flooring, again, is grunt work. I know the people who are flooring professionals are going to say otherwise, and there's all sorts of skills that you need to have, and they're not wrong. But installing flooring is pretty easy. It's not complicated. Does it require some specialized tools? Depending upon the type of flooring that you're putting in, absolutely. If you're putting in hardwood flooring, you're going to need a floor nailer or a floor cleat gun, whatever they're called. If you're doing laminate type stuff, I don't even know if you could consider that wood, but it's flooring. All you really need is a miter saw and one of those bar thingies to be able to tap it in once you get to a wall. It's not complicated. It takes some time. If you've got an extra pair of hands, it obviously goes a lot faster. And I've done a few dozen homes where I have ripped floors out, put new ones in. It's quite literally a pain in my knees and my back, but if I'm allowed to take my time with it, it gets done. And I think I do a reasonably good job of installing floors. So when it comes to floors, again, everybody always wants that wow factor. And even if you're doing something like laminate, it can get pricey. So installing floors goes on the easy side of the matrix. But as far as the cost is concerned, if you're doing hardwood, you're probably going to buy pre-finished, because nobody wants to sand 13 or 1400 square feet with a 6-inch sander. So then you're renting tools to be able to do the job, and that balloons the cost. And you're also probably not going to install crappy flooring, so you're going to spend some money there. Flooring, easy side of the matrix, but towards the top end when it comes to cost. Next on the list is by far my favorite furniture project, and that is beds. I like building beds because I think beds are pretty simple. It's basically a headboard, a footboard, and two boards that connect it together and some slats across that hold the mattress. It's not that complicated. The hardest thing about bed building is depending upon how big of a bed, if you're doing a twin versus a cow king, the length of those side pieces, those rails that connect the headboard and the footboard, again, being a woodworker, you're obsessed with getting them flat when in reality, you don't. All you need to do is get them close, and if they've got a little bow in it or something like that, you have the bow facing out, and then you pull it back together with all of those slats that you are running across to support the mattress. That's the easy peasy way. What makes, I think, secondarily to that, what makes bed building a little more challenging is we always want to make it a little more artistic because, we spend 7 or 8 hours every single day in a bed, so we want it to look good. So we're not building them out of MDF. We're using quality materials. We want to have a little bit higher design, so there's a contrast nature. Maybe we're mixing materials or we're blending styles together. And again, it's a very personalized project because people spend a lot of time in them doing whatever it is that they do, and they want the bed to look good. So, as far as where I'm going to put them on the matrix here, I'm going to put them kind of towards the middle. I think this is a perfect project, like the absolute perfect beginner project. You can spend some money on the materials, but the construction of it isn't terribly difficult. And there's all sorts of hardware that is available to us that's not all that expensive so that you can connect everything together and it ain't going to fall apart even under the most stressful of activities. But bed building, I think, is that sweet spot on the chart here. So I'm going to put it a little on the easier side of things and a little towards the threshold between expensive and cheap. Bed building goes right there. Next on the list, mantles. Again, this is an easy project, I think. Mantles can be all sorts of different things. They can be a massively long, wide mantle. They can be a relatively small thing, depending upon the size of the chimney. And installation really isn't all that complicated either. Oftentimes, what I do when I've got a mantle build is I just go over the existing one. I create a box that just goes over and covers up the existing mantle, and that's easy peasy. I don't have to worry about drilling into, brick or whatever other stone the chimney is made out of. And there are all sorts of brackets that are on the market these days to where me as a maker, I don't have to come up with some convoluted solution. Mantles essentially are either a box that slips over something that is existing, or they are just a solid piece of material that has a particular shape and goes above the chimney. Not that complicated, usually pretty inexpensive. So mantles, they're going to be more towards the easy side of things, but again, it's kind of an anchor point in a person's living room or wherever the fireplace is, so they want it to look a little bit nicer. So I'm going to put them a little further up here on the expense side of things. Oh, I had to refill my coffee. Okay, the next project on the list, doors. I think doors have this mythic aura about them that they are incredibly difficult and no basic human should ever attempt them. And I want to share with you, I don't think that's true. I've built a few dozen doors in my lifetime, mainly screen doors, and I've got to say this, they're pretty easy. Building a door is a lot like building a face frame for a cabinet. You've got rails, you've got stiles, and the hardest thing about building doors is making sure that they don't warp because of the seasonal changes. So joinery matters. And I think, a combination of different types of joints, a lot of wood glue, using the right material, an exterior grade material, a white oak, or hell, I've done a lot of them out of cedar. That all plays into whether or not your door is going to hold up over the long term. What really makes door building kind of tricky from the standpoint of construction is just simply because it is so large and trying to get it as square as possible. And what's really annoying is obviously we're trying to put something that is square into a casing that probably isn't. So in the end, there's a lot of fine tuning and trimming involved. And then, mounting a door by yourself can be kind of tricky. So, I mean, it helps to have an extra set of hands. But I don't think door building is nearly as difficult as YouTube woodworkers would make it out to be. I am going to, on the matrix, put it more towards the difficult side of things. I don't think nearly as difficult as chairs, but that's my personal opinion. And then as far as expense is concerned, I try to build them as inexpensively as possible, but I've never truly built an entryway door, like one of these massively large entryway doors that probably cost thousands of dollars. I've never done that. So for me personally, they still stay relatively low on the expense side of things. So doors, they go right there. The second to last project on this list, trim work. I've lived in 5 houses, I think, at this point, and each one of them, I have always redone the trim. Trim work is annoying, but it's not hard. And what makes trim work difficult for woodworkers is oftentimes we have these monolithic, altars that we put our miter saws in, and then we can't bring the tool to the job. That's what I think makes trim work really difficult. Another thing that makes it tricky is if we want to do it well with as few cuts as possible, then we need to work with full length pieces of trim, which usually are 16 feet. And handling a 16-foot long piece of trim on a mobile miter saw stand can get kind of tricky. So you got to have auxiliary fences, you got to have work holding solutions, you got to have all of these other little accessories. And then if you're doing things like crown molding, it gets a little trickier. But in the end, I think trim carpenters would make you think it's a lot harder than it really is, and it isn't. If you're going to be into getting that perfect fit and finish, then you're going to want to scribe baseboards so that they fit the contour of your never flat floors. If you're going to try and get that perfectly tight joint in your corners, then you're going to want to cope at least one side of the trim. I have tried that numerous times. I apparently just don't have the ability to do it properly. So I just live with getting it as close as possible and whipping out caulk. It does the trick. Nobody has ever judged my trim work and said, God, you fucking suck at this. Nobody's ever done that. And here's the dirty little secret. A lot of times you can mask the imperfections in your trim work by just putting your furniture in front of it. Problem solved. It's genius. And if whoever, is coming in after you and buying the house, that's their problem to deal with, not yours. You did the thing. So trim work, I know trim carpenters, you guys are going to eviscerate me all you want. That's fine. But as far as trim work is concerned, it is pretty easy. It's pretty cheap. Again, depending upon what materials you're going to use. If you're using painted MDF or if you're going to go the actual wood route, yeah, you might pay 2, 3, 4 times more than painted MDF. But in the end, it's not that expensive to trim out a house and it's not that complicated. All right, we have reached the final project. Picture frames. Picture frames are a piece of cake. Okay, again, there is a million different ways to skin a cat when it comes to how you go about building your picture frames. The sky is the limit as far as how much money you want to put into one. But realistically, you're talking about a frame that's going to do what, a 5x7, a 4x6, or maybe something a little bit larger. Picture frames are dirt cheap. Okay, you could go all kinds of crazy with your material choices and make it out of Madagascar ebony. And yeah, it would be ridiculously expensive for what it is, but even still, it's not that much money. The traditional way of making picture frames with miter joints, that can be somewhat challenging because, again, as woodworkers, we are always consumed with fit and finish. But in the end, once it goes up on a wall or you put the little backer thingamaboober on it and it goes on a mantle or on a table, nobody ever judges whether or not your miters are perfectly closed. Nobody does that. What are they focused on? What's in the picture frame? Now, I have come up with a way using, again, my CNC to never have to deal with miters as far as picture frames are concerned, and that has completely changed my picture framing life. But every once in a while, I still do miters, and I don't find it to be nearly as challenging or difficult as YouTube would love to make it out to be. So as far as picture frames, again, they are going to be on the easy side of the matrix. They are definitely going to be on the lower side of the matrix as far as inexpense is concerned. And, well, you're going to make a whole bunch of them. So why make it more complicated than it needs to be? All right, if you weren't counting, that's 15 total projects that are incredibly common when it comes to being a woodworker. And I think all of them, regardless of trim work versus building tables or a shed or doing floors, it all basically boils down to these 4 things. That if you can become proficient as a woodworker in these 4 things, then woodworking becomes pretty easy. And that is, number 1, you got to keep stuff flat. Now, wood sometimes doesn't really want to cooperate, and if you've got a board or boards that don't want to cooperate, here's the easy solution. Don't use them. Make sure that you can get things flat. Secondly, if you can get things square, your life is going to be a lot easier. Woodworkers fixate on thousandths or millionths of an inch as far as square is concerned, and I would say if it's square enough, it's good enough. The average layman is never going to notice if you are a couple of thousandths off. Not that big a deal. Thirdly, is can you fit stuff together? Can you join material together? Glue and screws, perfectly acceptable in most applications. Pocket holes, totally fine if you can cover and mask them. And then if you want to knock yourself out with more advanced types of joinery like mortise and tenon or, the ever elusive dovetail, that is totally on you, boo-boo. But as long as you can get boards together, the vast majority of the world is going to think you are a fucking magician. And fourthly is once you've got it together, if it stays together, it's good enough. We all know that wood moves, and despite our best efforts, sometimes things fail. But if it doesn't fail to the point where like a bed comes crashing down or a chair breaks or a workbench can't support its own weight. It's not that big a deal. So those are the 4 fundamentals. If you can get proficient in them, and notice I'm saying proficient, not master them. None of us are woodworking masters. If anybody says that they are, they're full of shit. We are all practicing woodworkers. If you can get proficient at those 4 things, woodworking becomes pretty easy. So if you want to argue with me in the comments, knock yourself out. I look forward to it. Thanks for watching. We'll see you in the next one.